So, what is racial ethnic identity? To put it simply, a racial ethnic identity is the combination of both race and ethnicity. The reason why I decided to kind of intertwine both of them is because I believe they're both so related to each other in today's society that it's really hard to just address one of them. Race is the perceived biological characteristics that a person has. These can be things such as white, black, Asian, among many others, while ethnicity has more to do with cultural origins and cultural roots. So, how does racial ethnic identity influence us? Well, it can influence us both internally and externally. The way we perceive our race and our ethnic ties can really change how we interact with others. Similarly, the way others interact with us based off of how they perceive our race, also racial ethnicity, also influences us. So it's kind of like a circle of influence. And the way we perceive ourselves and the way other people perceive us can really deal with our success or our failure. So now that you know what racial ethnicity is and why it's so important, for my project, I decided to interview people from various racial ethnicities to see how it affects their daily lives. So without further ado, I would like to thank everyone that took the time out for this interview, and I hope you all enjoy.
So my race is, of course, Black, and my ethnicity is African American or Afro American.
My name is Jorlando. Um, I'm American Italian. My father's from Southern Italy, Sicily, and my mother's from Brooklyn.
My name is Zoe Tarun. I am Asian, I guess, and Filipino.
I'm Ocean Sebastian Sark, and I'm Hispanic. My mother's from Ecuador.
I'm Alessandra Bowen. I am a Latina from Honduras, and I live there full time, except I'm studying at Cornell.
So what does the research say about racial ethnic identity? Well, according to a paper that studied the racial ethnic identities between Black and white Americans, they saw that Black Americans usually prioritize their racial ethnic identity more than to white Americans. Additionally, they saw that for both groups, they varied their racial ethnic identity depending on the setting that they were in. So, for example, an Italian American may express more of his Italian culture when he's in a family setting than when he was in a school setting. Lastly, when asked about other social statuses such as socioeconomic status and gender, which one was the most important, both groups agreed that sex and gender is the most important in determining your social status. However, the paper only studied the effects of racial ethnicity on white and Black Americans. In addition, the paper was made in 1999, so it's fairly outdated for social constructs such as race. So now, what do people think about racial ethnicity now? In addition, how do people from other racial ethnicities, such as Filipino American or Ecuadorian American, think about racial ethnicity?
Culturally, it changes my life and the things that I value, but I feel like I'm not labeled differently most of the time from other white people. I find that when I'm at school or with friends in the workplace, I feel more American, I guess, because I'm around other people who, if I want to be in a similar culture, they are American as well most of the time. So I use that part of my culture to kind of communicate with people for sure. But whenever the same thing happens, though, if I meet someone who's not even necessarily in my family, if we have that similar cultural heritage, we always commune on that. I can talk to someone in Italian, or we can chat about things that might be similar culturally.
Is me every day with like as a Black American interacting with, say, other Black Americans. We all have a shared experience here in America because we are always, always the oppressed, always one of the most oppressed groups. There's a shared experience with Black Americans, but there's always a shared experience with Black people, period. And there's also that kind of like, common ground that's always with another Black American.
Like culturally, I inherited like a very specific work ethic, I guess, that maybe people who aren't like children of immigrants.
It comes from culture. What I believe is right and wrong just comes from culture. My mother being the one who raised us mainly in the house, all my culture, all my values, I guess you would say, came from her, and everything she got came from culture. So a heritage, she grew up over there.
So after hearing everyone speak, how important is racial ethnicity? Well, I would argue for all groups of people, racial ethnicity is equally important to their self-identities. While they got that influence in different ways, very clearly shows that their racial ethnic identity plays a role in who they are today. In addition, I would argue that there's now a greater emphasis on culture rather than race. Instead of speaking in terms such as white or Latino, they spoke in terms such as Italian, Ecuadorian. It also shows that cultural does not always have to be positive things. For Black Americans, they show that how they relate because of a shared struggle throughout the years. Lastly, I would like to point out that it seems like American children of immigrants, regardless of racial ethnicity, have a sort of relationship between each other. So now let's look at the shared struggles between racial ethnic groups. One struggle that I found between Black Americans and Asian Americans is that colorism exists between both groups.
Colorism comes from racism. Lighter skin is viewed as more beautiful than darker skin, and darker skin is viewed as ugly and inhuman and stuff. And that's not just in the Black community; that's in South Asian communities, Latino communities.
And when we talk about like Asian representation in media, for me personally, it was like you'd see a lot of like K-pop. So you have like this picture of what a beautiful Asian person looks like, and then none of them looked like me. So when I did see a Filipino woman in mainstream media, like they had a couple Miss Universes who won recently. All of the Filipino Miss Universes who won were like half European. So it kind of like instilled in me that idea that like to be beautiful as a Filipina, you have to have Eurocentric features.
Another shared struggle are preconceived notions or implicit biases. These are ways people think a certain racial ethnicity should act, even though it has nothing to do with the individual themselves.
Because of like the city I come from, because it was like #1 most dangerous city in the world for a few years. So many people think that the whole city is dangerous and that everywhere you go, you'll get murdered. But it's not true.
I'm a music major, and a lot of people don't know that I do opera. And stuff like that. And because that space has mostly been filled with white people, or and not many other people of color. So
The last shared struggle is this identity crisis of cultural identification. Since they're American ethnics, are they truly that other ethnic group?
So when I'm there, I'm always seen as American. And it's funny because when I'm here, I'm always, especially when people hear my name or hear me talking with my family, they always label me as Italian. So it's always funny. I'm never quite labeled as where I'm currently at.
Like being Filipino American, it feels like is its own separate thing. Because like I definitely, especially after growing up with a bunch of people who are not Asian at all, it's like I knew that I was culturally very different from them, but then going back to the Philippines, it's like, well, I'm not like them either, so who am I?
If you just say I'm Honduran, just say that, then it's kind of offensive because, like, let's say if you say you're Honduran, but grew up in the U.S. and I'm Honduran, but I grew up in Honduras, we both had very different experiences. For example, you didn't experience a very high crime rate, or you didn't experience living in a third world country. So because you're kind of taking away my pride and my experiences.
So how important is racial ethnic identity compared to other social statuses? Well, what I've learned is that it depends. Intersectionality is assessing how various social statuses affect a person all at the same time. The two things I did find that were most important to people were that racial ethnicity and socioeconomic factors are probably closely tied together. What I also found is that outside the U.S., various social statuses are different in terms of importance.
When compared to other social statuses such as gender, social class, religion, sexuality, how influential is your racial ethnicity compared to those? Do you think it's the most important, or do you think other things are more important than your social ethnicity?
I feel as though that's the part of me that's most noticeable. I mean, obviously you can see that I'm female, I'm a woman, but I feel like that's a very defining characteristic for me.
I think your socioeconomic, it's how much money you have really plays the biggest part in how people kind of treat you. I find But I do definitely see race play a big role.
I would definitely say it's the ethnicity and the socioeconomic status. But like the ethnicity also ties into religion because like it is very cultural over there for you to be religious, and a lot of their values come from religion. So I guess like you would say though I would say those three are the most influential. I mean, honestly, when I went to private school in high school, the biggest thing that stood out to me, yes, I was Hispanic, right? So being the only Hispanic in my grade was one thing, but it was also another thing was like I'm a minority both racially and socioeconomically, right? I come from a lower class family. We have, when I go over there, they're talking about how they're complaining about having to go downstairs to use the third bathroom. And I'm like, what are you talking about, third bathroom? We got one bathroom in the house, 5 people, So like things like that.
Kind of are intertwined. So it's an intersectional like thing. Depends on the person. It doesn't matter what the person is. They all have one of those things. So they're all together. It's all interconnected and stuff like that.
It's not gender, definitely not, nor race. It's economic status and your last name and who your family is. So it's very different.
Lastly, here are some final takeaways that really opened my eyes up to racial ethnicity.
Being the only one makes me prouder. But that's because I'm not afraid to say this is who I am.
Yeah.
Some people I know some people are more likely to conform than to be like, this is who I am, I'm not changing, I'm proud of it.
So I like to I think of myself more first generation because I am closer to the generation that came from Italy than I am with my mother's generation, who's kind of a little bit more removed.
Yeah.
But I also, I think those labels are kind of arbitrary in a way too. It really depends on how much you stick with the culture after you've emigrated.
The word Latinx, they're trying to appropriate my language and my culture. They think that replacing the O and the A with an X is inclusive, but it's not. Like, if Americans just really understood my language, they'd know that the word Latino is already like gender neutral, and it's also offensive to like people in my country or like third world countries because like 90% of them are not educated and they have bigger problems such as finding their next meal, like literally, or like trying to like just survive. And Americans here think that our problem are like Latinx and stuff.
Feelings about being considered Asian, and I do consider myself Asian, but it's like I don't feel that much of a unity in terms of like me and like other East Asian people that I know. And like I think there's an issue in the Philippines right now where there's like a lot of Chinese immigrants who are coming in, but then there's a lot of like elitism in that way because they have those very pale features, and so they like don't want to marry Filipino people, and so I don't know, it's like a weird internalized kind of inferiority thing that you kind of have to work through about being like, oh, I'm Asian, but I'm not Asian like they are, or something. I'm not Asian in the way that the United States wants me to be, or something like that.
When you first see any person of color, to be honest, get those notions out your head. You don't know that person. You never seen that person a day in your life. You don't know their story. So listen to it. Your first thing is to listen, not talk.